We're going to talk now to Anika Wells, new member for Lily in the 46th Parliament of Australia. Now, Anika, we almost saved your interview for our foreign news segment because you have described Queensland as the best country in the world.
And we have a very generous visa program administered by the Office of King Wally. So, come on in, the water's fine.
It certainly is. And, King Wally was up on the stage the other day providing the Wally Lewis Medal to our very own James Tedesco, but we won't, as a Blues fan myself, be reminding you of that too much this morning.
Tough week for Queenslanders.
Yeah, no, indeed. Yeah. But let me start. I want to ask you about a serious matter that we've been discussing with Annalise over the last few days, and that is this recognition issue. What are your thoughts on where that's at the moment? Obviously, I think Labor recognises you need to be cautious in politicising this issue.
That's right, and for me as a new MP, Craig Kelly is actually my neighbour in Parliament House. So in the interests of hoping that he does drop me over a lasagna, I think we should be focusing on working together and what we have in common. And I saw that Linda Burney has again spoken today about urging everybody to keep to the principles of the Uluru Statement and listening to both our First Nations people and then our broader community about what we have in common that will get enough support to get a referendum up.
Now, when it comes to the economy, we've also seen Josh Frydenberg out yesterday with the RBA Governor Phil Lowe saying that they're on the same page, they know how to stimulate the economy. Are you confident that the government is doing enough to help get more money in people's pockets?
Well, the other thing that the Treasurer did this week was fail to rule out privatisation as a way to fund infrastructure in states like Queensland. And that was big news up here, because if we know one thing about Queenslanders, it is that we are not for asset sales. So if the Prime Minister and the Treasurer think that privatisation is a way to get out of their budget problems to fund the infrastructure that we need up here in Queensland, well, Queenslanders know how that story ends.
And in terms of the broader economy, though, the Governor reiterated his belief that the fundamentals are strong and the economy's growing. Have people overinterpreted, the difference between the Treasurer and the RBA?
I think, speaking from my experiences here on the ground, people are worried, and the government can talk up the economy as much as they like. It doesn't mesh with how people feel about their budgets. And I think some of the election results can be explained by people feeling worried about where the economy is going and the uncertain future ahead. So I guess people aren't talking to me about what the RBA is saying. They're talking to me about wages growth and about stagnant wages growth and about cost of living feeling like it's going up.
When it comes to what you're hearing on the ground, Labor really was smashed at the election in Queensland in particular. What do you think really was not on message from the Labor Party in Queensland in particular?
I think, I guess I did 3 mobile offices in the first 3 weekends after we declared victory, and I was really touched by how generous people were with talking to me about why they couldn't embrace Labor at the last election. And probably the common trait in what I've heard so far here in Lily is that people felt they weren't content by any means. They were not content, but they looked around, they felt relatively comfortable, and ultimately like they had more to lose than they dreamed to gain. So the task for us is to demonstrate what we already know to be true, which is one of Labor's core values is aspiration and social mobility. And we've got to listen to the message that they were trying to give us at the ballot box and put together a platform about those things that they can embrace next election.
Anika, is it your view that obviously Jim Chalmers is Shadow Treasurer now. Is it important that Labor makes a big commitment, not just in, symbolism, but in personnel, in telling Queenslanders that you get them?
Yeah, I was absolutely stoked that Jim was elevated to that role, a very worthy recognition of the efforts that he has done both on the ground here in Brisbane and more broadly. Jim, I think if you read his first speech, he talks about social mobility as the driving motivation for him in politics. It's something that the area that he grew up in Logan, that's something that they all aspire to. And if you can get that right, you help the economy as well. You can do both at the same time. So I think Jim is the perfect person to drive that for us from the Treasurer's portfolio for the next election.
Now, when it comes to new MPs establishing themselves, one of the key things is your maiden speech, and you're picking to focus on millennials. What is it about millennials that you want to champion?
Well, my speech is about trying to be a good ancestor, and I just think it is a critical year, a critical term for us as a country, because 2019 is the first year where there are more Australians born after 1980 than before. It's the first year, and it's also the first year this year where there are more millennials in the workforce than Gen X and baby boomers combined. So despite the fact that we make up more than 50% of the population in the workforce now, we represent only 10% of the new parliament, and that's a problem. That's a problem because millennials are the ones who will endure the consequences that this parliament, of the choices this parliament makes, in 50 years' time. And Deloitte did a study on Australian millennials last year, and the results are horrifying. 2/3 of Australian millennials think that our government leaders are purely there to retain or improve their own political power, and they think that Australian political leaders, you can't trust what they say. And I think that's a problem for us, for everybody. And it certainly was borne out to some extent in the election results and how the election scare campaigns were successful. And it's also a problem for everybody moving forward if people can't have trust in their institutions.
And Anika, just finally on another issue I've just noticed in the West Australian, it's a story about the Queensland LNP conference this weekend. Apparently a number of coalition state MPs are going to debate as one of the agenda items whether to ban face coverings such as the burqa. Now, one Liberal quoted in this story suggests it might well pass at the conference, which would be hugely controversial. Another quoted in this report says they think it's outrageous and it won't pass. But what are your thoughts on that story that, as I say, I've just noticed this morning, a moment ago in the West?
Classic Queensland LNP that some of the same proponents of a very broad-based religious freedom bill would also be proponents of a motion to ban the burqa and to fail to see the contradiction in that. I mean, welcome to my pre-poll experience, to be honest. I guess we shall see where state conference lands. I mean, state conferences can get pretty wild. Let's see how that vote goes. But, not that they asked for my advice, but it would be to be focusing on Queensland jobs and how we are funding the infrastructure that we need sooner than 2026.
And just finally, on that point about millennials, if you want to represent them, surely you'd be still backing in Labor's calls to to get rid of negative gearing.
Negative gearing is an interesting one because my experience on the hustings in the campaign was that far more people were for our policy than against it. Far more. And, it's also a policy that we took to the 2016 election where, it is universally considered that Labor did very well. I guess the thing about this is that it wasn't just people under 40 who were worried about buying a home. It was the parents of people who feel like they can't afford a home who are coming to me saying that they support the negative gearing policy because they worry their kids will never be able to afford a home. And it's funny you mention this because the biggest stoush I had with my opponent was at the Nunda Town Hall about this issue. And he put forward a view that is held by many people, which is that millennials make lifestyle choices that prevent us from buying our first home, things like that. But, if you compare the what we spend on dining out compared to what our parents spend on dining out, if we cut back to the same amount of funds spent on dining out as our parents had, it would still take us between 100 and 113 years to save for a 20% housing deposit on a median house in Sydney. So brunch has become a very convenient scapegoat for structural inequality in this country, and we've got to do a lot more work in that space.
Anika Wells, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.